The desert dusk clung to the horizon like burnt cloth, the sky bleeding crimson above the jagged silhouettes of Dry Creek's mesas. Colton Briggs wiped the dust from his eyes and tightened the cinch on his saddle. Red, his stallion, snorted but didn't flinch. The horse hadn't lain down in 2 nights, not once. Colton noticed it first on the second evening, how Red stood stiff-legged near the water trough, ears pinned, eyes darting like something invisible circled close. Even when the wind died and the coyotes went quiet, the horse remained agitated, tethered to something deeper than fear. He'd seen horses spook before, rattlesnakes, cougars, distant gunfire. This was different. Red didn't tremble. He didn't bolt. He watched, stared rather, unmoving, focused on that wooden trough like it might come alive. At first, Colton figured it was the long rides getting to him. They'd pushed hard through the Mojave to avoid the lawmen around Flagstaff. Maybe the stallion was just tired and strange in a new place, but the water was clean, the feed untouched. And now the 4th sunset was settling across the plain, and Red still wouldn't rest. Colton crouched by the trough, dragging his fingers through the dry earth around it. Flies hovered thick, but not from the water. Something beneath the surface stank of rot. He leaned in, nostrils flaring. There it was, a scent. Not manure, not old wood, but sour, like meat left out too long in the sun. He scooped a handful of dirt. Clumps clung wet between his fingers. He dug more, faster now, the soil resisting in heavy patches. Red let out a sharp breath and backed away, hooves stomping dry dust into the air. That's when he saw it. A sliver of white bone poking from the dirt like the tip of a buried tooth. He blinked and leaned closer, dug further. The shape grew clearer, smooth, rounded, unmistakable. A human femur. Colton dropped the dirt and stumbled back. His hand hovered near his holster, but there was no enemy to draw against. Only the quiet desert, the bruised sky, and a grave no one had spoken of. He glanced back at Red. The stallion stood rigid, eyes wide, breath shallow. Someone had buried a body here, or something had. Before we go any deeper into the secrets hiding beneath this lonely stretch of desert, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Tales like this don't come often, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Colton knelt again, slower this time, brushing more soil from the edge of the bone. It wasn't alone. The ground around it sank in subtle dips, like the earth remembered others. He hadn't come here looking for trouble, just shelter, quiet, safety. But the land had different plans, and Red still wouldn't sleep. The wind picked up that night, dry and restless, hissing through the brittle sagebrush like it carried secrets too old to name. Colton sat on the porch of the crumbling ranch house, lantern flickering beside him, rifle across his knees. Red paced in the dirt below, restless as ever, refusing the feed bucket, eyes never straying from the trough. Colton hadn't slept either. His thoughts kept returning to that bone. How clean it was beneath the dust, how white. Not the color of something buried long ago, but fresh, recently buried. And he hadn't seen a soul near this land for miles in any direction. The nearest homestead was 6 hours away by horseback. He should have been alone. That's what he'd counted on. He lit a cigarette with a shaking hand. The flame danced wildly before catching. Every so often he'd glance at the trough, half expecting it to move. He thought about leaving, saddling Red and riding out before dawn. But something about that bone nagged at him. It wasn't just the death. It was where he'd found it. Why bury a body under the water? As the hours crept by, Colton heard something. Soft, distant. A scrape. Then silence. He stood, boots crunching against the porch as he stepped down. The desert stretched around him, empty as always. But the sound had come from close, too close. He moved toward the trough slowly, lantern held high. The light shimmered off the water's surface. Red let out a low, uneasy whinny and backed further into the dark. Colton knelt again, hand brushing the dirt beside the trough. This time he dug slower, more deliberate. And again, more bones, a fragment of a rib. Then a small vertebra, not more than a few inches long. Something stirred in his gut. These weren't from one body. A breeze carried a foul, earthy scent to his nose, making him gag. He dropped the lantern. The flame sputtered but stayed alive. Shadows twisted. Colton turned, scanning the darkness. The wind whispered again, dry words brushing against his ears. Not real words, just the shape of them, like a memory trying to form. Then he remembered. An old sheriff he'd known in New Mexico, dying from 2 gut shots, had warned him once, "There's a place where the land don't keep the dead down, where the dirt remembers every drop of blood. Stay clear of Dry Creek, boy." He hadn't thought of it in years, hadn't realized this was the same place. But now, with the trough bleeding bones and the air thick with dread, he felt it deep in his marrow. Something was wrong with this land. It wasn't just cursed, it was awake and watching. Morning came slow and heavy, dragging itself over the horizon like it didn't want to see what the night had done. Colton hadn't slept. His eyes were sunken, fixed on the trough, and the silence stretched thick across the ranch like a shroud. Red had stopped pacing but wouldn't go near the water. Instead, he stood beneath the lone mesquite tree, ears twitching, body still as stone. Colton was gathering his things, saddlebag, rifle, matches, ready to ride. Whatever this place held, he wasn't sticking around to find out. But as he rounded the back of the barn, a movement caught his eye. A man, old lean as dried jerky. He sat on the split-rail fence like he belonged there, boots dusty, hat low over silver hair. He didn't look surprised to see Colton. "You're digging in cursed soil, son," the old man said, voice like rust scraping metal. Colton didn't raise his gun, though he wanted to. "This is supposed to be abandoned." The man shrugged. "It is, mostly. Except for the dead and me." "Name's Cooper," Colton lied. "Didn't mean to trespass." The old man smiled without warmth. "Ain't my land, used to be. Belonged to a fella named Josiah Black. That was before the killings." Colton stiffened. "What killings?" The old man hopped off the fence, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. "Back in '57 there was a gang, mean bastards. Robbed the Dry Creek stage, killed a marshal, burned a church down with folks inside they holed up here on Black's ranch. And they got what they had coming." The old man's eyes darkened. "Locals found 'em, hung some, shot the rest, buried 'em out back under the trough. That's where Black said the land'd keep 'em still." Colton's blood ran cold. Under the water. Black was superstitious. Said water seal's evil. Said if you bury a man beneath the trough, he can't walk the earth again. The old man glanced toward it. But he was wrong. Colton's jaw clenched. "You're saying the bones out there belong to outlaws?" "Some. Others. Not so lucky." The old man's voice dropped. "That ground's been fed too many souls. Men, women, children. It don't care. It remembers." The air grew still. Colton felt the weight of the old man's words pressing down like a storm. "Why are you still here?" he asked. "Because somebody's got to warn the next fool who thinks this land is just dirt and wind." Colton looked at the trough again. The earth around it seemed darker now, like it drank the light. "I didn't come here looking for ghosts," he muttered. "They come looking for you all the same," the old man replied, turning back toward the horizon. Colton stood alone once more, the silence returning like a curse reawakened. Dust hung in the barn like old secrets. Colton pushed open the warped door and stepped inside, heart pounding beneath his ribs. He needed answers. Real ones. The old man's words echoed in his mind, unsettling and half-true. Something about this land dug under his skin, and he had to know why. The barn was cluttered with rusted tools, torn tack, and crates gone soft with age. He moved carefully, kicking aside debris until he reached a loft ladder. Climbing it revealed a hayloft, empty but for a rotting trunk buried under straw. He pried it open. Inside, wrapped in dry oilcloth, was a ledger bound in cracked leather. The name Josiah Black was pressed into the cover in faded gold. Colton opened it, eyes narrowing. It wasn't a ranch log. It was a list, dozens of names written in neat lines, some crossed out, others circled, and beside a few, a symbol, 3 downward lines beneath a crescent moon. Colton had seen that mark before, in prison, carved into walls, branded into flesh. He flipped to the last page. The ink changed, sloppier, rushed, then smeared red. Blood. The final entry read simply, "They buried them all, but the earth never forgot." A noise below made him freeze. A shuffle, then quiet. He slid the ledger into his coat and descended the ladder slowly, hand brushing the grip of his revolver. No one was there, only the wind through the slats. That night, Red wouldn't come near the barn. Colton set up camp beneath the stars, rifle in his lap, the ledger open beside him. The symbol, scratched in the margins, stared up at him like an eye. He thought about the names, about who decided who got circled, who got crossed out. What kind of man kept a list of the damned, and why some weren't just marked, they were erased. The wind picked up again. Coyotes howled in the distance, but even they stayed far from the trough. Colton tossed dirt onto the fire, heart beating hard. Somewhere, faint and fragile, a voice whispered. It wasn't words, not really. It was his name. He stood, scanning the darkness, revolver raised. No one. But the whisper came again. Not behind him, beneath him, from the earth. Colton backed toward Red, saddle already half-strapped. The horse was sweating, eyes wide and furious. But even in panic, he didn't step closer to the trough. Colton looked back at the ground. If the ledger was real, if Josiah Black kept that list for a reason, then the land held more than bones, it held memory. And memory had a voice. Colton returned to the trough at dawn, shovel in hand, knuckles white around the handle. The ledger hadn't left his coat pocket, its weight heavier than any bullet he'd carried. Red stayed tied under the mesquite, ears back, head low. The horse had stopped eating entirely. The dirt was hard at first, crusted from the desert chill, but softened as he worked. Colton dug past the spot he'd uncovered before, carving wider, deeper. The first body lay curled like a child, jaw missing, fingers twisted. Then another, and another. Too many. And they weren't all men. He paused, hand trembling. One skull was smaller, delicate, a child. The earth around it was compact, almost protective, as if the dirt tried to hide it from the sun. Colton fell to his knees, breath shallow. These weren't just outlaws, these were innocents. What kind of man would bury them here? He dug more, frantic, sweat pouring despite the cold, a rusted spur, torn cloth, a doll's arm, wooden and cracked, a wedding ring clinging to brittle bone. This wasn't punishment, it was concealment. He remembered Elias's words, "That ground's been fed too many souls." The old man hadn't said who'd done the feeding. Maybe Josiah Black hadn't just been a victim of fate. Maybe he'd been its dealer. Colton sat back, covered in earth and guilt. He'd done bad things, robberies, shootouts. He'd left men bleeding behind saloons and banks, but this was something else. Mass graves weren't about justice. They were about silence. He felt the ledger in his coat again, the names branded into those pages. He wondered how many of them were lying here now, their stories never told. He reached for the doll's arm, but the ground pulsed beneath his fingers. Not shook, pulsed, like a heartbeat. He jerked back, stumbling over the shovel. The soil rippled, then stilled. Nothing more. But Colton's skin crawled. This place was alive, and it remembered everything. He stared down at the graves, hands filthy, soul heavier than before. It wasn't just the evil that had been done. It was the way the land had swallowed it whole. Red neighed sharply behind him. Colton turned. Elias stood a few yards away, face grim. "You shouldn't have dug that far." "How long have you known?" Colton rasped. "Long enough to stay out of reach," Elias replied. "You bring up what's meant to stay down, and it don't go quiet again." Colton rose slowly. "I needed the truth." "Then you got it," Elias said. "Now it's yours to carry." The wind shifted, and for a second Colton thought he heard crying from beneath the soil. He closed his eyes, fists clenched. This land wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by memory, and memory doesn't sleep. Colton didn't sleep that night, and neither did the wind. It howled across the desert with teeth, rattling old boards and stirring whispers from the trough. The graves were still open, shallow holes in cursed soil, and something inside them shifted every so often, just enough to remind him he wasn't alone. At dawn, he saddled Red. The horse trembled under his hands but didn't resist. Colton wasn't sure where he was going, just away from bones and ledgers, away from cries in the dirt. He barely rode an hour before he saw the figure ahead. Tall, broad-shouldered, walking up the trail like he owned it. Dust clung to his black duster, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. But Colton knew the walk. He knew the gait. That same heavy step had once carried through army camps and outlaw hideouts. Jonah Briggs, his brother. Colton slowed Red to a stop. Jonah didn't, just kept walking until they were face to face. "Well," Jonah said, his voice gravel and smoke. "Wasn't sure I'd find you here." Colton didn't move, didn't leave a trail. "You never do," Jonah replied. "But this place, it talks, like a wound you can smell from miles off." Colton's grip tightened on the reins. "You tracking me or just haunting old graves?" Jonah smiled, sharp and bitter. "Heard a rumor. Man riding under the name Cooper. Hiding near Dry Creek. Figured only one fool would run here." Colton didn't answer. He felt the ledger pressing against his ribs like a confession. Jonah's eyes narrowed. "You found it, didn't you?" "Found what?" "The truth. About what we did. About what we buried." Colton's jaw tightened. "I buried a few things, sure. But not like this." Jonah stepped closer. "That land took what we gave it. It was never meant to give it back." "You knew," Colton said, voice low. "I made peace with it." Colton shook his head. "You didn't come for peace." "No," Jonah said. "I came to make sure you don't open any more graves." His hand hovered near his belt. Colton's did the same. Years of blood between them boiled up in silence. "I didn't come here looking for the past," Colton said. "Doesn't matter," Jonah answered. "The past came looking for you." Then he turned and walked away like a storm moving slow but sure. Not in retreat, in warning. Colton sat frozen in the saddle, heart pounding. Jonah had changed, older, harder, and he wasn't just another outlaw anymore. He was something darker. Colton looked back toward the ranch, the graves, the trough. His past wasn't buried. It was waking up. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge when the shot rang out. Colton hit the ground hard, shoulder-scraping stone. Another bullet shattered the water trough behind him. Red screamed and bolted into the distance, wild and bleeding from the flank. Dust exploded around Colton's boots as he crawled toward the barn, revolver clenched tight. He didn't need to see the shooter. Jonah. The bastard wasn't just warning him now. He'd come back to finish what he started. Colton reached the barn door and kicked it open, diving behind an old plow as another shot punched through the wood. His mind raced. The graves, the ledger, the weight of everything they'd buried now dragged up by his own hands. He fired blind around the corner, just enough to make Jonah take cover. Silence. Then footsteps, slow, measured. Jonah's voice floated in. "Should have let it be, Colt." Colton shouted back, "What are you afraid of? That someone might remember?" "I don't care who remembers," Jonah growled. "I care who digs, and you're digging like a man begging to be buried." Colton's jaw clenched. He ducked low and darted toward the back door, boots crunching straw and ash. A flash of movement behind the tool racks. Jonah was circling. As Colton reached for the door, a sharp pain bloomed in his side. He collapsed hard, breath gone. Blood soaked his shirt. Clean shot, low but bad. Jonah stepped through the shadows, gun raised. "I warned you," he said, voice hollow. Colton coughed, struggling to prop himself up. "You're protecting a lie." "I'm protecting peace," Jonah spat. "The kind we earned. You go stirring up what's buried, and we both pay." Colton's hand found something in the dirt, Elias's old rifle, half buried behind a sack of feed. He gritted his teeth, swung it up fast, and fired. The blast threw Jonah backward into the doorframe, shoulder torn. He dropped his gun, cursing through gritted teeth. Blood poured down his sleeve, but he didn't fall. He looked at Colton like a man more angry than hurt. Then he turned and fled into the brush, stumbling but alive. Colton dragged himself out of the barn, every breath a fire in his ribs. Elias's body lay nearby, sprawled in the dust, eyes open toward the sun. He'd never even heard the shot. Colton knelt beside him, hands trembling. No pulse. No breath. Just silence. The ranch stood still again. And yet, beneath Elias's collar, something caught the light. Colton peeled back the shirt and froze. A map, tattooed into the old man's skin, faint but precise. A circle drawn near the cottonwood tree, a mark he recognized from the ledger. Elias had known more than he ever said. Colton looked toward the horizon, blood soaking through his coat. The graves weren't the end, they were just the beginning. The map etched into Elias's skin led Colton across scorched earth, each step a struggle. Blood still leaked from his side, soaked into a ragged bandage, but he pushed on. The cottonwood stood twisted and dry on a rise beyond the ranch. Its gnarled branches clawed at the sky like a curse, begging to be answered. He reached it by dusk. The soil beneath the tree was soft, unnatural. Colton dropped to his knees and began to dig. No shovel, just his hands. Each claw of dirt brought more of the past to light. By the third foot, he hit wood. Rotten, splintered. He tore through it. What lay inside wasn't just bones, it was a pile. Bodies crushed together, arms tangled, mouths frozen in silent screams. Children, women, men. Dozens of them, layered like they'd been dumped, not buried. But what made Colton's blood run colder wasn't the dead. It was the stone placed at the base. Flat, black, carved deep with the same symbol from the ledger. 3 vertical lines beneath a crescent moon. Around the edge names, dozens of them. Some he recognized, some he didn't. And at the bottom, carved deeper than the rest, judged by those who hunt the wicked. Colton stepped back, heart pounding. This wasn't justice. It was ritual. These weren't just graves. They were a warning, a doctrine. Someone, some group, had made this land their gallows. He sat heavily in the dust, staring at the stone. The ledger hadn't just tracked debts or crimes. It was a death warrant signed by shadows. Josiah Black wasn't a farmer, he was an executioner, and the land, this cursed soil, had been fed by men who thought they were doing God's work. The irony burned in Colton's gut. He'd killed men for less. He thought of Jonah, how calm he'd been, not just about the bodies, but about the system, the silence, like he'd known all along. Like he'd sworn to protect it. Colton looked down at his hands, cracked and bleeding. He wasn't just digging up bones, he was digging up a legacy, and he was part of it. He reached into the pit and lifted the stone. It pulsed in his grip, warm, impossibly heavy. The symbols flickered as if breathing. The wind died. The air turned still, and somewhere beneath the cottonwood, something shifted. A groan from the earth, not a cry of pain. A warning. Colton dropped the stone and stepped back, breath caught in his throat. He had wanted truth. Now he had it. This land wasn't cursed because of the dead. It was cursed because of the living. Because of men like Josiah, because of men like him. Night fell like a curtain soaked in ash. Colton sat beneath the cottonwood, the stone back in place, the mass grave now covered in silence. He didn't light a fire, didn't dare. The land around him breathed cold and slow, like it was waiting for something to return. And it did. Footsteps, steady, crunching gravel. He turned. Jonah stood at the edge of the rise, silhouetted by moonlight, one arm still bloodied, wrapped in a torn shirt. His revolver hung low, loose in his hand. "You found it," Jonah said. Not a question. Colton didn't answer. Jonah took a step closer. "You always were the one with the conscience." Colton rose slowly. "This wasn't justice. It was order," Jonah replied. "We weren't saints, Colt, but we cleaned up what the law wouldn't touch." "You buried kids," Colton hissed. Jonah's face twitched. "Collateral. They were raised by monsters. That rot passes down." "That's not judgment," Colton said. "That's slaughter." A gust of wind swept through, dry and sudden. The branches groaned. Beneath their feet, the ground shuddered. Jonah looked down, uneasy. "It's stirring again." "You know why," Colton said. "It wants to finish what we started." Jonah raised his gun. Then we finish it. Colton didn't flinch. Or we bury it for good. Jonah fired. Colton dove, bullet grazing his shoulder. He rolled behind the tree, returned fire. The night exploded with gunshots. Wood splintered. Dust erupted. The grave mound cracked open, spewing up old bones and newer ones alike. Jonah circled, limping but steady. You think you're different, Colt? You wrote names in that ledger too. I was trying to survive, Jonah snarled. So was I. They fired again, shots echoing off stone and silence. One of Colton's bullets hit true. Jonah staggered, fell to one knee, but didn't drop his weapon. I should have killed you when you ran, Jonah gasped. You already did, Colton muttered. A final shot split the night. Jonah collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. His gun slipped from limp fingers. He stared up at the stars, eyes wide, chest rising slower, then still. The ground trembled. Colton turned toward the graves. The stone was gone. In its place, darkness. Not just shadow, but something deeper, a hollow pull. Colton dragged himself to the pit's edge. Bones shifted. The earth moaned. Then, silence. He pulled a flask from his coat, emptied it onto the mound, lit a match. The fire roared. It wasn't just flame, it was release. Screams echoed. Faces flickered in smoke. The land cried out in fury and relief. Colton stood back, chest heaving. The cottonwood burned like a pyre, and the wind finally was still. By morning, the fire had died. Ash coated the earth where the cottonwood once stood, black and grey like a wound finally scabbed over. The pit had collapsed in on itself, a shallow crater where bones had screamed and memory had burned. Colton stood at the edge, coat torn, side aching, smoke in his lungs. But something was different. Red. The stallion stood near the water trough, calm, quiet, eyes half-lidded in rest. For the first time in days he'd lain down, not in fear, in peace. Colton limped to him, ran a hand along his mane. The horse snorted softly, then dozed again. It was over. He looked toward the hills. Dry Creek shimmered in the distance, heat rising off sand and stone. There was nothing left for him here. No vengeance, no shelter, no absolution. But there was freedom. Not the kind he'd once stolen from banks or stolen names. The kind that comes when ghosts stop whispering. He saddled Red and rode out slowly, past the trough, the barn, Elias's grave beneath the tree. He didn't speak, didn't look back. The desert took him in with open arms, and behind him the land stayed silent. If this story struck something deep, if it made you feel the weight of the past or the hope of redemption, don't forget to subscribe. There are more tales riding these dusty roads, and you won't want to miss them. Colton didn't know where he'd go next. Maybe north, maybe nowhere. But the sun was warm on his back and the wind no longer stung. He rode until the ranch was a memory. Until the curse was a scar. Until the outlaw and the land were strangers once more. And if you're still riding with us, click the video on your screen to uncover what happened when a drifter heard laughter coming from a grave that hadn't been dug yet.